Former Vice President Mike Pence, and it's my honor to join you and people all across our country on this National Day of Prayer. You know, since the time of our nation's founding, prayer has always been a central part of American life. Even before the American Revolution, the Second Continental Congress established a day of fasting and prayer. President Abraham Lincoln urged Americans to pray so that, in his words, the united cry of the nation would be heard on high and answered with a blessing. And now, more than 2 centuries later, we gather in that same spirit and ask God to bless our land, the land we love, because America is a nation of prayer. For our family, prayer has always been an important part of our lives, just as it has been for millions of Americans. During my time as vice president, I can tell you, the sweetest words that I ever heard are when people would walk up to a rope line, stop me at an event, and simply reach out a hand and say, "I'm praying for you." And for those prayers, Karen and I are deeply humbled and will always be grateful. The Bible tells us that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. So on this National Day of Prayer, I just wanted to take a moment to encourage each one of you to pray for America.
And prevent mass casualties on this scale, Governor Pence. And prevent mass casualties on this scale, Governor Pence. Responsibility to protect civilians and prevent mass casualties. The U.S. have a responsibility to protect civilians and prevent mass casualties on this scale, Governor Pence.
The United States of America needs to begin to exercise strong leadership to protect the vulnerable citizens and over 100,000 children in Aleppo. Hillary Clinton's top priority when she became Secretary of State was the Russian reset. The Russian reset. After the Russian reset, the Russians invaded Ukraine and took over Crimea. And the small and bullying leader of Russia is now dictating terms to the United States to the point where all the United States of America, the greatest nation on earth, just withdraws from talks about a ceasefire while Vladimir Putin puts a missile defense system in Syria while he marshals the forces and begins. Look, we have got to begin to lean into this with strong, broad-shouldered American leadership. It begins by rebuilding our military. I mean, the Russians and the Chinese, broad-shouldered American leadership. It begins by rebuilding our military. American leadership. It begins by rebuilding our military. And the Russians and the Chinese have been making enormous investments in the military. American leadership. It begins by rebuilding our military. And the Russians and the Chinese have been making enormous investments in the military. We have the smallest Navy since 1916. It begins by rebuilding our military. And the Russians and the Chinese have been making enormous investments in the military. We have the smallest Navy since 19. It begins by rebuilding our military. In the Russian American leadership, it begins by rebuilding our military. And the Russians and the Chinese have been making enormous investments in areas. Work with our Arab partners real time right now to make that happen. And secondly, families with children can move out of those areas. Work with our Arab partners real time right now to make that happen. And secondly, on civilians in Aleppo, the United States of America should be prepared to use on civilians in Aleppo. The United States of America should be prepared to use military force to strike military targets of the be prepared to use military force to strike military targets of the should be prepared to use military force to strike military should be prepared to use military force to strike military targets of the should be prepared to use military force to strike military targets of America should be prepared to use military force to strike military targets of the Assad regime to prevent them from this humanitarian crisis that is taking place in Aleppo. There's a